Good morning, everybody. Our today's lecture is on the anatomy of cerebral gray and white matter. The learning objectives for my today's class are: I will describe the internal structure of cerebrum under following headings: white and gray matter of each cerebral hemisphere, basal ganglion, fibers of white and gray matter, and applied aspects of gray and white matter fibers. Cerebrum is composed of two cerebral hemispheres. These hemispheres are connected by corpus callosum, which is a band of commissure fibers. Each hemisphere is hollow inside due to the presence of lateral ventricle containing cerebrospinal fluid, which is produced by the choroid plexus. Each hemisphere is composed of outer gray and inner white matter. Some masses of gray matter are also found in the white matter. These masses of gray matter which are found in the white matter are called basal nuclei or basal ganglia. Let us go to this slide to see the interior of each cerebral hemisphere. As shown in this slide, inside each cerebral hemisphere there is a cavity. The cavity of each cerebral hemisphere is called lateral ventricle. Now, if we take a section of each cerebral hemisphere as shown in this figure, you will find it consists of outer gray matter and inside we have white matter, gray and white matter. Outer gray matter constitutes cerebral cortex. The main difference between white and gray matter is that white matter mainly consists of myelinated axons, whereas gray matter mainly contains cell bodies, axon terminals, and dendrites, as shown in this figure. So this is the composition of gray matter, which is composed of axons or soma, dendrites, while as the white matter is composed of myelinated nerve fibers and supported by glial cells. Within outwards structure of cerebral hemispheres, there are two lateral ventricles in two cerebral hemispheres, one for each. Outer to that we have inner white matter, and outer to that we have cerebral cortex consisting of gray matter. The cerebral hemispheres are covered with a layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. Located in the interior of the cerebral hemisphere are lateral ventricles, one in each cerebral hemisphere, masses of gray matter called the basal nuclei or basal ganglion, and nerve fibers. The nerve fibers are embedded in neuroglia and constitute white matter. Lateral ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles, one in each cerebral hemisphere. Each ventricle is roughly C-shaped. Cavity of lateral ventricle is lined with ependyma and filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid is produced by the choroid plexus. The lateral ventricle may be divided into a body that occupies the parietal lobe of each cerebral hemisphere, and from which anterior, posterior, and inferior horns extend into the frontal, occipital, temporal lobes respectively. In this diagram, red represents the body which is present in the parietal lobe. This arrow represents the anterior horn which is present in the frontal lobe. The second arrow represents the posterior horn which is present in the occipital lobe, and the third arrow represents the inferior horn which is present in the temporal lobe of each cerebral hemisphere. The lateral ventricles communicate with cavity of third ventricle through interventricular foramen. Now coming to the cerebral cortex, as shown in this diagram, it is composed of gray matter, which in turn is composed of soma and dendrites. It forms the outer layer of the cerebrum, forms around 40% of cerebrum by volume. 60% is constituted by the white matter. If we look at this animation, inside the cerebral gray matter, we have cerebral white matter. Now within the white matter, we have masses of gray matter. These masses of the gray matter are called basal ganglion. Now inside each cerebral hemisphere has a cavity which is demonstrated by this black area. It represents the two lateral ventricles within two cerebral hemispheres. What is the difference between gray matter of brain and spinal cord? Composition of both gray and white matter of brain and spinal cord is same, but orientation of the fibers is different in spinal cord and brain. This can be explained on the basis of embryology. As shown in this figure, gray matter forms the outer layer in brain with some masses of gray matter within the white matter. These masses of gray matter are called the basal ganglion. In case of spinal cord, white matter is outside with gray matter in the form of letter H within the white matter. Now, what are basal ganglion? These are masses of gray matter situated within white matter in each cerebral hemisphere as shown in this diagram. These masses of gray matter lie lateral to the lateral ventricle. What are basal nuclei? They are, the nomenclature of the basal nuclei is, they are the corpus, striatum, the amygdaloid nucleus, which is considered to be part of limbic system, and claustrum. The corpus striatum, which includes caudate and lentiform nucleus. Lentiform nucleus in turn is composed of globus pallidus and putamen. Functionally, their connections and transmitters form extrapyramidal system. Let us go to the organization of basal nuclei. Basal nuclei are also called the basal ganglion. They are composed of corpus striatum and amygdaloid, as already said, which is a part of the limbic system. Claustrum consists of neostratum and pellucidium. In the neostratum, in addition to putamen, we have caudate nucleus, whereas pellucidium is composed of globus pallidus. And lentiform nucleus in turn is composed of putamen and globus pallidus. What is caudate nucleus? Large C-shaped mass of gray matter closely related to lateral ventricle and lies lateral to the thalamus. The lateral surface of the nucleus is related to internal capsule, which separates it from lentiform nucleus. The parts of the caudate nucleus are, it has a head which is related to lentiform nucleus as shown in this figure, and as a body, this body forms of lateral ventricle. It has a tail, and tail is related to the amygdaloid nucleus. Lateral to this we have thalamus. Relation of caudate nucleus with lateral ventricle is very important clinically. Head of the caudate nucleus is related to the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Body of the caudate nucleus forms the floor of lateral ventricle. If we take a section of basal ganglion at the level of interventricular foramen, in this horizontal section, the arrangement of structures from medial to lateral is, in the midline, we have septum pellucidum, which separates anterior horn of two lateral ventricles. Lateral to lateral ventricle, we have the caudate nucleus. Posteriorly, medial to the internal capsule, we have thalamus. Now, lateral to the caudate nucleus, we have the anterior limb of internal capsule. Genu is formed by meeting of the posterior limb of internal capsule with the anterior limb. Both anterior and posterior limbs of internal capsule lie medial to lentiform nucleus. Lateral to the lentiform nucleus, we have external capsule with a band of white matter. Outer to external capsule, there is a mass of gray matter called claustrum. Horizontal section of cerebrum at the level of interventricular foramen. So superiorly we have corpus callosum, which forms the roof of anterior horn of lateral ventricle. Then two lateral ventricles are separated by septum pellucidum. Lateral to the anterior horn is the caudate nucleus. Lentiform nucleus is separated from the caudate nucleus by anterior limb of the internal capsule. Then there is anterior limb of the internal capsule which joins the posterior limb at genu, and medial to the posterior limb of the internal capsule is thalamus. The lentiform nucleus is a well-shaped mass of gray matter whose broad convex base is directed laterally and its blade is directed medially, as shown in this figure. It is buried deep in the white matter of the cerebral hemisphere and is related medially to the internal capsule, which separates it from caudate nucleus and thalamus. The lentiform nucleus is related laterally to the thin sheet of white matter, the external capsule, that separates it from sheet of gray matter called claustrum. Let us go to this diagram to make things more clear. So this is the outer border of the lentiform nucleus. We can also call it as base of the lentiform nucleus, and it has two blades demarcated by these black dotted lines. So lentiform nucleus is separated from anteriorly from caudate nucleus by anterior limb of the internal capsule and posteriorly from thalamus by the posterior limb of internal capsule. So we can say that lentiform nucleus lies lateral to the anterior and posterior limb of internal capsule, while as caudate nucleus lies medial to the anterior limb of internal capsule. Thalamus lies medial to the posterior limb of internal capsule. This lentiform nucleus is again divided into two parts: globus pallidus, which forms the pellucidium, and putamen, which with caudate nucleus forms the neostratum. Outer to the lentiform nucleus we have mass of the gray matter that we call it as external capsule, and outer to the external capsule we have claustrum, which is a mass of gray matter in the insular cortex. So external capsule separates claustrum from the lentiform nucleus. In this diagram you can say that cerebral cortex is arranged in layers. If we go from medial to lateral, starting from thalamus up to the subcortical white matter of insula, we find the layers are thalamus and caudate nucleus are medially. They are separated from putamen by anterior and posterior limb of the internal capsule. Lentiform nucleus lies lateral to internal capsule. In fact, it indents the internal capsule to form the genome. Then outer to the lentiform nucleus is external capsule, which is a band of white matter. Outer to external capsule is claustrum, which is a layer of gray matter. Then sixth layer is white matter of the insula. So we can see there is alternately we have thalamus consisting of the gray matter, internal capsule consisting of white matter, lentiform nucleus again gray matter, external capsule white matter, claustrum gray matter, and white matter of the insula. There are 6 layers in total. 3 of them are gray matter and 3 are composed of white matter. The claustrum in turn separates the external capsule from subcortical white matter of insula. As already said, inferiorly at its anterior end, the lentiform nucleus is continuous with the caudate nucleus. Functions of corpus striatum. The functions of corpus striatum is concerned with the muscular movement, which is accomplished by controlling the cerebral cortex rather than through direct descending pathways to the brainstem and spinal cord. Amygdaloid. The amygdaloid nucleus is situated in the temporal lobe close to the uncus. It is attached to the tail of caudate nucleus and is considered a part of limbic system. Claustrum is a thin sheet of gray matter that is separated from the lateral surface of lentiform nucleus by external capsule. Lateral to the claustrum is the subcortical white matter of insula. The functions of claustrum is unknown. So in this section you can see lentiform nucleus. Lateral to lentiform nucleus is the external capsule, and lateral to that is the claustrum. Claustrum is a mass of gray matter whose function is unknown. Cerebral white matter. The cerebral white matter is composed of fibers of different diameters supported by neuroglia. The nerve fibers may be classified into 3 groups according to their connections. We have commissure fibers, association fibers, and projection fibers. Coming to the commissure fibers, the commissure fibers connected the corresponding areas of two cerebral hemispheres, as shown in this diagram. They are as follows: the corpus callosum, the anterior commissure, the posterior commissure, the fornix, the habenular commissure. Corpus callosum is the largest commissure fiber of the brain. It connects the two cerebral hemispheres. It lies at the bottom of the longitudinal fissure. So this is the median longitudinal fissure between the two cerebral hemispheres. At the bottom of it is corpus callosum, demarcated by this black line, while as red line is fissure between two cerebral hemispheres. To understand the anatomy of this corpus callosum, let us give an incision along the median sagittal plane. Now let us give another incision in the coronal plane. So one in the sagittal plane, median sagittal plane, another in the coronal plane. So what do we see? The first incision cuts the cerebral hemisphere into two symmetrical halves. These two symmetrical halves are connected by corpus callosum, as shown by this red arrow. Now in the coronal incision cuts the cerebral hemispheres into two halves. These halves are connected by corpus callosum, as shown by these red dotted lines. The corpus callosum is the largest fiber pathway of the brain. It links the cerebral cortex of the two cerebral hemispheres. It roofs much of the lateral ventricle. It forms an arch about 10 centimeters in length, with an anterior end 4 centimeters from the frontal poles and a posterior end about 6 centimeters from the occipital poles. The median region of the trunk of the corpus callosum forms the floor of the great longitudinal fissure. The parts of corpus callosum are rostrum, genu, body, and splenium. Rostrum is the thin part of anterior end which is prolonged posteriorly to be continuous with the upper end of the lamina terminalis. Genu is the curved anterior end of corpus callosum. The fibers of the body extend laterally as the radiations of the corpus callosum. The body arches posteriorly and ends as the thickened portion called splenium, splenium being the thickest part of the corpus callosum. Now if we see this corpus callosum in a horizontal section, so genu appears anteriorly at the anterior end, and posteriorly we have splenium. Extensions from corpus callosum in the frontal lobe form the forceps minor, and extensions of the corpus callosum into the occipital lobe form forceps major, while as the extensions of the corpus callosum into two cerebral hemispheres form commissural callosal fibers. To make things more clear, let us go to this diagram. This diagram makes the concepts of these fibers more clear. Forceps minor. The fibers are directed lateral of the genu, curve forwards into the frontal lobes. Radiations of the corpus callosum. The fibers of the body extend laterally into cerebral hemispheres to form the radiations. Forceps major. Traced laterally, the fibers in the splenium arch backwards into the occipital lobe and form the forceps major, as shown in this diagram. What is septum? Some fibers of the corpus callosum form the roof and lateral wall of the posterior horn, and also lateral wall of the inferior horn of lateral ventricle. These fibers are called the septum. What is septum pellucidum? Septum pellucidum is a thin vertical sheet of nervous tissue consisting of white and gray matter, covered on either side by ependyma. It stretches between the fornix and the corpus callosum. Anteriorly, it occupies the interval between the body of the corpus callosum and the rostrum. It is essentially a double membrane with a closed slit-like cavity between the membranes. The septum pellucidum forms a partition between the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles. So it separates the two lateral anterior horns of two lateral ventricles. As shown in this diagram, septum pellucidum is marked by this red dotted line. The second type of the fibers which are present in the cerebral white matter are association fibers. The association fibers, these are nerve fibers that essentially connect various cortical regions within the same hemisphere. These fibers are divided into short and long association fibers. The short association fibers lie immediately beneath the cortex and connect adjacent gyri. As shown in this diagram by these red dotted lines, these fibers connect the adjacent gyri. These fibers run transversely to the long axis of the sulci. Long association fibers, in contrast, connect distant gyri within the same cerebral hemisphere. These fibers are collected into named bundles that can be dissected in a formalin-hardened brain. The term formalin-hardened brain is used because of the fact that in living state, the brain is in a semi-solid form, but after the death of the person, when we preserve it in formalin, it gets hardened. And it is in this hardened section that we can appreciate various fasciculi or bundles of white matter fibers in the white matter of each cerebral hemisphere. And these bundles are the superior and inferior longitudinal fasciculus, Cingulum, uncinate fasciculus, the perpendicular fasciculus. Superior longitudinal fasciculus, as shown by this red dotted line, is the largest bundle of nerve fibers. It connects the anterior part of the frontal lobe to the occipital and temporal lobes. It is situated deep within the cerebral hemisphere and is related to the lateral border of caudate nucleus. The inferior longitudinal fasciculus runs anteriorly from the occipital lobe, passing lateral to the optic radiations, and is distributed to the temporal lobe. The cingulum, as shown by this red dotted line, is a long curved fasciculus lying within the white matter of cingulate gyrus. It connects the frontal and parietal lobes with parahippocampal and adjacent temporal cortical regions. Projection fibers. The third type of the fibers present in the cerebral white matter are projection fibers. They connect the cerebral cortex with the lower levels in brain and spinal cord. These fibers include large numbers of both corticofugal and corticopetal projections. By corticofugal fibers, we mean which arise from the cerebral cortex and go to the brainstem and other areas of central nervous system. And corticopetal fibers are those fibers which arise from the periphery and go towards the cerebral cortex. Corticofugal projection fibers converge from all directions to form the dense subcortical white matter mass of corona radiata. The corona radiata is continuous with the internal capsule, which contains majority of the cortical projection fibers. Now coming to the internal capsule. In a horizontal cerebral section, the internal capsule appears as a broad white band with a lateral concavity which accommodates the lentiform complex. Lentiform nucleus, already said, it is wedge shaped, it has a base and it has two blades. These blades indent band of white matter medially and convert into anterior and posterior limbs. This band of white matter is called internal capsule. The point where the anterior and the posterior limbs meet is called genu. The parts of this internal capsule are anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb. It also has a retrolenticular and as sublenticular parts. Internal capsule passes between these nuclear masses carrying centripetal and centrifugal fibers from brainstem and cortex respectively. These fibers radiate from different areas of the brain to form corona radiata. The fibers contained in this corona radiata are frontopontine fibers from frontal lobe to the anterior limb of the internal capsule, paretopontine lobe from parietal cortex to the internal capsule, temporopontine, and optic radiations. Optic radiations originate in the lateral geniculate body and they go to the occipital cortex. Now these yellow dotted lines represent the centrifugal fibers which originate from the cortex and go to the brainstem. As shown in this diagram, we have the anterior limb of the anterior capsule, posterior limb of the internal capsule, the lentiform complex. As shown in this diagram, both anterior and posterior limbs are medial to the lentiform nucleus. The head of the caudate nucleus is medial to anterior limb and the thalamus is medial to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Applied anatomy. The basal nuclei. Because of the close relationship that exists between these nuclei and internal capsule, tumors of the caudate or lentiform nuclei may cause severe motor or sensory symptoms on the opposite side of the body. Tumors pressing on the anterior two-thirds of the posterior limb of the internal capsule will cause progress to spastic hemiplegia, while more posteriorly situated tumors will produce impairment of sensation on the opposite side of the body. Functions of commissures of the cerebrum. The major commissure is the large corpus callosum. The majority of the fibers within the corpus callosum interconnect symmetrical areas of cerebral cortex. Because it transfers information from one hemisphere to another, the corpus callosum is essential for learner discrimination, sensory experience, and memory. Congenital absence of corpus callosum is rare. When it occurs, the clinical history usually lacks diagnostic features. That is, most of the patients are asymptomatic. This is perhaps not surprising, since apparently little disturbance of the function occurs when large parts, and in some cases all, of the corpus callosum have been surgically divided for control of intractable epilepsy. Lesions of internal capsule are very important clinically. The internal capsule is frequently involved in vascular disorders of the brain. The most common cause of arterial hemorrhage is atheromatous degeneration in an artery in a patient with high blood pressure. Because of high concentration of important nerve fibers within the internal capsule, even a small hemorrhage can cause widespread effects on the contralateral side of the body. Not only is the immediate neural tissue destroyed by the blood which later clots, but also neighboring cell fibers may become compressed or be edematous. So because these fibers are tightly packed, even a small lesion can cause widespread clinical manifestations. I want to summarize my lecture as each cerebral hemisphere consists of an outer layer of gray matter called cortex. The two cerebral hemispheres are connected by corpus callosum, which is a band of commissure fibers. In fact, the largest band of commissure fibers. The white matter of cerebellum consists of myelinated axons. These axons are of three types. In a hardened wet specimen, we can see these bundles of nerve fibers by making different sections of the brain. Masses of gray matter within each cerebral white matter are called basal ganglion or basal nuclei. These masses of grey matter lie lateral to the lateral ventricle at the level of interventricular foramina. The projection fibers connected the cerebral cortex with lower levels in the brain and spinal cord. Important component of these projection fibers is internal capsule. In the internal capsule, the fibers are tightly packed. The posterior lip of internal capsule contains corticospinal tract. Even a minor vascular injury results in widespread clinical manifestations because of the close packing of the fibers in the internal capsule. Now let us go for a quiz based on this lecture. You will be provided with an MCQ with 4 options. You have to choose the most accurate one. The first question is, which horn of the lateral ventricle lies in temporal lobe? So I will go with next question is, which of the following statement is not true? Corpus callosum connects corresponding areas of 2 cerebral hemispheres. Corpus callosum is largest commissure fiber. Congenital absence of corpus callosum is often symptomatic. Surgical division of corpus callosum is done for intractable seizures. So the correct answer is C. Congenital absence of corpus callosum is often symptomatic. As I already discussed that we don't have any symptoms if there is congenital absence of corpus callosum. These patients usually are asymptomatic. Which of the following is not a long association fiber? Superior longitudinal fasciculus, inferior longitudinal fasciculus, uncinate fasciculus, pyramidal fasciculus. So there is no fasciculus named as pyramidal fasciculus. So the correct answer is D. Next question is, which of the following is medial relation of posterior limb of internal capsule? Caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, thalamus, and putamen. The correct answer is C. Caudate nucleus forms relation with the anterior limb. It lies medial to it. Lentiform nucleus lies lateral to both anterior and posterior limbs. Thalamus lies medial to the posterior limb. Next question is, which of the following is a false statement? Anterior limb of internal capsule lies lateral to the caudate nucleus. Lentiform nucleus consists of globus pallidus and putamen. External capsule lies lateral to claustrum. Lentiform nucleus indents internal capsule from outside. The correct option is C. External capsule lies lateral to claustrum. External capsule in fact lies medial to claustrum. False statement about septum pellucidum is: A is a double-layered membrane. B separates an anterior horn of 2 lateral ventricles. C, it is covered on either side by pendyma. D, it is a thin vertical sheet of nervous tissue consisting of white matter only. The answer is D. It is composed of white matter only because this is a double-layered membrane consisting of both white and gray matter. Our next question is, which of the following is false about septum? A, long association fiber. B, forms roof of the posterior horn. C, forms lateral wall of the posterior horn. D, it forms roof of the inferior horn. It forms roof of the inferior horn is incorrect because it forms the lateral wall of the inferior horn, not the roof. Our next question is, anterior limb of the internal capsule contains which fibers? Frontopontine, corticonuclear, corticospinal, occipitopontine. The correct answer is frontopontine fibers. Involvement of the corticospinal tract is seen in lesions of which part of the internal capsule? Very important question, clinical point of view. Anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, retrolenticular part of the internal capsule. The corticospinal tract is contained in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So it is the posterior limb is the correct answer. Do not forget to subscribe this channel. Press on the bell icon to remain updated. Thank you for watching this video. Give me your feedback on YouTube